Did you know that God and Satan both are preserved in mythology? A lot of people don't know that. Check this out. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. I want to read this to you, okay? John chapter 4, chapter 1, 1 through 4, it says this. Let me get my glasses on here so I can read. I'd say I could use an extra arm. Okay, here we go. John chapter 1, verse 1 through 4 and verse 14 says this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, and all things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Verse 14, and the Word was made flesh, very important there, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, and the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, we know that in the beginning, we just read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. The Word was God. Did you know that if you go into the Greek, go into a concordance and look at the Greek language, do you know what that word for word is? It actually is translated as logos. Okay, that's very important. It's translated as logos. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 17 now. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. Where are we going here? Acts 17. Okay. Check this out. Acts 17. I'm going to start in verse 20. We'll read 22 to 23, and then we'll jump down to 28. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill. Now keep in mind, Mars, that was named after the Roman god Mars, and the equivalent of him was Ares. So we already got some idolatry here. And he said, ye men of Athens, which was named for Athena, a goddess of wisdom, and I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious or way too religious, for I passed by and beheld your devotions, and I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you, verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also as your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Now, wow, what does that mean? Well, first of all, we have John declaring this guy Logos to the church. Paul's coming around, he's saying, hey, look, y'all have an unknown God that you don't really know. You don't really have a good solid understanding of him, and I want to tell you about him. Do you know that if you go studying the Greek mythology, you'll find out that before anything was, they had a God that pre-existed everything, a God that pre-existed all things. And it's believed that he was actually the origin of all the other gods. From him came these other deities. And you know what his name was? Logos. Think about that for a minute. The Greeks preserved Logos, who's basically in our English word, that would be word, the word, and it's another name for Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ has been preserved in the Greek and Roman mythologies, and we never even knew that. Now think about it. That's pretty powerful, because that means that the Greeks had a basic understanding. Why? Because they understood the stars and the heavenly bodies, and they knew someday this was going to take place and transpire. Now, I want to share something with you, because, Abraham was a very special man. He was actually taught by Noah, according to the book of Jasher 9:5. And we know that from the antiquities of the Jews, that the children of Seth, which Noah would have been one of them, they had understanding of the heavenly bodies, and they knew what they were supposed to do with them. That they were able to document them. And Enoch was the first one that documented that and wrote it down. And you can find all this in the Antiquities of the Jews, book 1, section 2, chapter 3, verse 69 to 71. And also in Jubilees chapter 4, you can read about Enoch writing them down and even putting a marker in the earth so people would not forget it. Jubilees 4, 16, 17, and 19. Now for the biggie. Let's talk about Lucifer and find out where he was mentioned in mythology. Boy, I tell you, it's like 22 minutes after the hour. Boy, this is going fast. I'm loving this, man. This is good stuff. Lucifer is mentioned in mythology. There's this legend of Kronos and Uranus. Uranus was Kronos' father up in heaven, and Kronos is associated with a Roman god known as Saturn. Now, I'm going to come back and tell you some stuff about Saturn here in a minute, but Saturn was believed to have rebelled against his father in heaven. And what did he do? What does Kronos Saturn character do? He used a sickle-shaped blade to castrate Uranus, according to the legend. And it doesn't take much of much of a stretch to really understand what he's doing. He's trying to cut off, attack, or destroy what? The seed of his Father in heaven. And look at how many times that we see this. John 10:10 tells us that the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And look at how many times we see this in the Bible, where Satan is making an attempt to either kill the offspring of God, kill his people, or look at how he's tried to come against the bloodline of Christ, or even directly as Christ himself. Cain killed Abel in Genesis chapter 4. Then you have the doings of the sons of God, the angels, according to Job 38, that came down in the days of Noah to actually corrupt the gene of Jesus Christ in Genesis 6. You come to Genesis 12, Genesis 26, and Genesis 42 to 46. I know it's a lot of chapters, but there you have these famines in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it got so bad in Jacob's day, he had to basically pack up and move to Egypt just so he'd have enough food to sustain his family. So these famines were come. I believe they were actual attacks from the devil to try to wipe out the lineage of Christ. And then we come up to Exodus chapter 1, 15 to 16. And this is when the Pharaoh rose to power and had the Hebrew children murdered, had them put down. And this is paralleled later in Matthew 2:16 when King Herod wanted to wipe out all the children at the time that Jesus Christ was born. Now get this, here's one you may not notice. You remember when Jesus was on the sea with the disciples and that great tempest came up? In Matthew 8:23 to 27, the word tempest there in Greek is seismos, and it's actually translated as an earthquake. This was I don't know how big it would have been, but it would have been closer to something like a tsunami that would have been coming against Christ when he was on this river when he was on the lake with his disciples. And this is just a few times where the devil had come against Christ to annihilate the seed, either the seed of men or the Son of God, and it didn't work. Another thing, after Kronos was defeated, he was actually committed to the second firmament, where he became associated with the god of time, or a harvest, if you will. And I think that's very interesting, because Acts 7:17 to 19 tells us that when it came time for the promise to be fulfilled, that's when Pharaoh rose up and he persecuted the children even unto death. Now look at this, Ephesians 2:2 and 2 Corinthians 4:14 tells us that Satan is the prince of the power of the air, and he also tells us that he's the god of this age, or god of this world. So these all line up with descriptions of Satan in ancient Greek mythology. Now, if you go study in Judges 8:21 and 26, you'll find out that there was a time when during the time of the judges, there was these people that they had crescent moon symbols and shapes as their emblems, and they were commanded to break them off the camel's back when they were defeated. And look at how many times this, by the way, crescent moon or sickle shape, this is another motif of some of God's religions and his goddess relationships. You can find this with the goddess Ishtar. You can find it with the goddess Selene or Luma, depending on if it's Greek or Roman. Artemis and Diana, depending on Greek or Roman. And also it's very much associated with Islam as a crescent moon is the shape of that. So that's what we have there. Now, as I said before, Saturn was believed to be a fallen angel who rebelled against God. And the Romans had a festival called Saturnalia, which was celebrated with drunken revelry at the end of December. And this is how December the 25th got pulled into this when they began to Christianize things, how they began to merge this stuff. Now, I hope I'm not going too fast, y'all. This is exciting stuff for me. The Aztecs and the Mayans had a god. The Aztec is called Quetzalcoatl, and to the Mayans it was called Kukulkan. Okay, and this was a winged serpent. Which is what Satan is, according to Exodus 25:20 and Revelation 12:7-9, and he was called the rainbow serpent. In Ezekiel 28:13, you'll find out that this serpentine, this dragon creature, he has a breastplate of stones, very similar, not identical, but similar to the priest and the high priest and that worked in the tabernacle. He was considered to be the god of life or light and the god of wisdom. And 2 Corinthians 11:14 tells us that Satan is transformed into a messenger of light. We have that parallel. And in Ezekiel 28:12, Satan is called, or Lucifer is called the sum of all wisdom. So we have that. And this is very interesting. You have to know that Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, they actually required human sacrifices, just like Satan requires the blood of innocent people to go against it. So now I want to talk for a minute because this is really getting into some good stuff. We're about halfway through my notes right now, so I hope you're learning something. I hope this is making sense to you. But there's two sets of gods that's been worshipped throughout the centuries past, and the first group of them was called what I'd refer to as the celestial gods. They were from the heavens, and then the other gods would be the terrestrial gods, or those that dwelt in land, and then you have the heroes of mythology. Now, it's like I said, you have gods that came down from heaven. Sometimes it was just one god of the air, like maybe Zeus or something, or the different pantheons have different names for different gods. And at other times it was several gods or goddesses. Now check this out. The Norse mythology, they have the Assyr gods, and they were the ones that came down from heaven to interact with mankind. The Aztecs had, let me see if I can get this right. This is the Zimima. That's what they were called, and they were gods that came down out of the heavens and interacted with mankind. The Sumerians had a group of people called the Anunnaki, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about the Anunnaki, and they were also associated with the Draconians, or the reptilian race of aliens that we see in the UFO movement that we hear about from time to time if you follow the UFO movement. And if you don't know what a draconian is, or an Anunnaki, these aliens were actually made famous through television, miniseries, and motion pictures, such as Buck Rogers in the 25th century, and also back in the 80s. I know I'm dating myself. 1983-84, they had a miniseries called V, which was about the visitors that came down. They turned out to be reptilians, and of course, they did a reboot of V. They're believed that they come from the planet Nibiru or Planet X. Now, you continue these sky gods that came down to interact with mankind. In the Greek, they were called the Titans. Okay, and by the way, Kronos, who we shared earlier, who had some connections with Satan, he was considered to be one of these Titans that originally came down. And you know, the Hebrews have another story about these entities. They didn't call them gods. They were entities that came down to earth. And guess what they were called? In Hebrew, they were referred to as the Hebrew words, the Hebrew words Grigori, and it's what we call now watchers. And it's another branch of angels. And next week, we're going to be getting a lot into talking about the nature of angels and demons. And that's going to lead us into studying where do these UFOs, how do they tie into mythology and these angels? What's going on there? So we have that. And another thing that these things have, not only do they have these beings that come down from heaven, but that there's always this cosmic war, something's going on. You know, the Anunnaki, they warred with their father Anu. You had the Titans clashing with Uranus, and you had the Watchers doing battle and going to war with Jehovah, or sometimes he's simply called El, because El, that's the name of God. Now there's much biblical documentation for this stuff. A lot of biblical documentation. If you look at Genesis 5:15-20, you hear about a man by the name of Jared. Jared's name means to descend or come down, and according to the book of Jubilees, chapter 4, verse 15, the year he was born was when the angels or the watchers descended and came down. Very interesting. By the way, the word Anunnaki means those who came from heaven to the earth. So we have that parallel. Now, I want to read to you something from the pre-flood world in Genesis chapter 4. This is, when I found this out several years ago, it blew my mind away. Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, verse 20, it says this. And Ada bare, now this is Lamech's son. Lamech was the seventh, from Adam going through his son Cain. And Lamech took unto him two wives. The name of one was Ada, and another was Zillah. And Ada bare him Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. Now that word tent there is very specific. It doesn't mean that they lived in tents like you go camping in. The word tent there in Hebrew, it's translated every place else in the Bible, especially in the Torah, as tabernacle. And it is a permanent shrine used for centralized worship. So we see here that Jabal, I don't know when he lived because there's no ages given here, but this could be in the same time period that these angels came down to earth after they fell, and they would erect these tents, these tabernacles that were used for worship. And I find it very interesting that they have cattle over there, because cattle oftentimes was used for sacrifice to the gods, especially when when you get into the UFO movement. I can't wait to study that one here in a few weeks. There's always cattle mutilations. It's the same parallel coming back and forth, and these reoccurring themes down through history between these gods, these goddesses, and these sky deities that came down. Now, I want to share this with you. It's kind of a quick side note here. When you look at the pre-flood patriarchs, they all lived to be about 900 and something years old. Methuselah lived to be 969. He's the oldest man on record that ever lived. But Noah lived on both sides of the flood. He lived 500 years, and he got Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And when he was 600, that's when the flood came. And then he lived another 350 years after the flood, and that gave him a lifespan of 950 years. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they lived to be about 600 years. And the next few generations, they made it to about 400 years. Then finally get down to the time of Abraham. He lived to be about 915. Nimrod, who died the same year as Abraham, but he was 40 years older, he lived to be 215. And then finally, when you get to the time of the Psalms, where Moses is writing some Psalms, he said that man's life expectancy will be capped off at 80. And I said this to do all this. If you are 200 years old, okay, and you know someone that's 300, 400, 500 years old, then they're going to seem almost godlike to you. And especially if you don't have, if your culture has begun to get corrupt, and especially if they had their health was so good, they could go for, they almost couldn't die because their body would heal themselves so well, then these people would actually begin to look as gods. So I don't believe so much that that a lot of these gods were gods. I just think that they were humans that were living to be really, really old. And at one point, I forgot where it starts off here, but if you go read Genesis chapter 11, you'll see that starting in verse 10, you'll see that this is exactly what would happen with the patriarchs. It got to where they were living so long, but as the generations went along, the people start dying younger and younger, to where actually people were living past their grandchildren and longer than their great grandchildren after a certain point. So I think this is a very easy how you can see where people could actually get mistaken for gods, even though technically they weren't.